George Bush's first war speech for a crusade against the enemies of civilization was a crude appeal to this propaganda line of the superiority of Western civilization over the rest. Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization thesis was seized upon for its obvious war propaganda value by George Bush and others. The Christian fundamentalist right was George Bush's base. It got him elected in 2000 and re-elected in 2004. And the president has remained steadfastly loyal to this political force. Hence, the September 11 attack on the World Trade Center, instead of being treated as an international crime, was transformed into a war against civilizations. As a consequence of this division of the entire world along religious lines, Osama bin Laden, who was an unknown to most of us, was catapulted into fame and became a household name. The primary purpose of the war on terrorism propaganda today is political, the building of empire. It's based on the stereotyping of cultural identities along narrow religious lines. Countries with majority Muslim populations are now made Islamic, and the social cultural complexities of these societies are narrowed down to the question of hardened religious beliefs. Religion becomes the defining element of the culture, society, political outlook, and beliefs of Muslim peoples. Women become religious communal subjects, that is, Muslim women or Hindu women instead of Indian women, for example. But the life of Muslim women in Malaysia, Indonesia, India, Saudi Arabia, and Mindanao are not identical. They're quite different and in significant ways. If they're religious, they have common protocols of prayer, like in other religions. They do, however, suffer commonalities of oppression and discrimination as women, but the degree and the specific forms of this oppression are conditioned by their national and local contexts, and not solely or even decisively by their religion. I argue that the politicization of religion has historically been detrimental to the progressive cause, as illustrated by the history of the struggle of anti-colonial nationalism and liberation. At the heart of the anti-colonial struggle for independence was secularism. The secular state everywhere was the product of profound political and social transformations. The diluting of secularism is a reflection of the unfinished character of this social transformation. The incomplete resolution of the women's question and the struggle for gender equality today is an expression of this unfinished character of the struggle for national liberation or liberation. Anti-colonial nationalism's egalitarian ideologies won the support of masses of women. The struggle for independence and national liberation was also envisaged as being culturally inclusive, as opposed to European nationalism. In this talk, I put forward a political analysis of these movements and not a theological critique. To understand this phenomena, we need to pay attention to history and the social political contexts, and not base it on some essentialist interpretation of religion. Theologically, political Islam embraces both historically progressive and reactionary positions. Those which assert that Islamic tenets are compatible with values such as freedom and democracy, and those which advocate going back to the past, a revolt against history. The Islamist movement is complex and multi-layered, with competing Sunni and Shiite backers. Historically, fundamentalist political Islam has traditionally joined hands with the colonial masters against the progressive movements, including the women's movement. The West recruited, funded, and built it as a force against progressive movements and secular nationalist regimes. By narrowing the space for a secular progressive politics, they ensured the rise of these Islamic fundamentalist movements. The defeat of Egypt under Nasser in 1967, the war against Israel, significantly weakened the secular modernist project in the Middle East, and Islamism rose in its wake. It also paved the way for the rise of the Saudi Arabian monarchy with its Wahhabi interpretation of Islamic law, which includes the stoning of women for supposed adultery, amputating limbs of thieves, and public beheading for other crimes. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, with the support of the CIA, Saudi Arabia organized an Islamic front as an alternative against pan-Arab nationalism. This network included the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Hamas in Syria, Sarakat Islam in Indonesia, the Front for Islamic Salvation or FIS in Algeria, and Jamaat Islami in Pakistan. In Indonesia, Sarakat Islam provided many of the foot soldiers in the coup against President Sukarno, wiping out the Communist Party and murdering as many as 2 million leftists. In Pakistan, during the dictatorship of Zia-ul Haq, Jamaat Islami was the main tool of the dictatorship to curb the anti-dictatorship movement. In Iran, a CIA-executed coup which overthrew the progressive nationalist government headed by the National Front paved the way for the victory of the clergy in the 1979 revolution. The United States restored the Shah to his throne and established one of the most brutal intelligence forces in the world, the SAVAK. The progressive and secular forces were either destroyed or seriously weakened, while the religious elite were left almost untouched. No one believed that a movement led by the mullahs could overthrow the monarchy, which is what happened. The women's movement was the first to organize in opposition to the clergy's antisocial laws, including the introduction of Sharia. They smashed the women's resistance. Women were jailed, stoned, and even beheaded. And the clergy mobilized Islamic women against the feminists under the slogan, "Neither East nor West, Islam is best." This was an important lesson for the women's movement of the Iranian experience. Religious fundamentalists do mobilize women along political religious lines against democratic forces. The 1979 revolution in Iran gave political Islam a major boost. Islamic fundamentalism organized itself as a state, and Shiite Islamists in the Middle East gained powerful governmental support in the early days of the regime. Iran today is in the Bush administration's line of fire, but I argue that the US campaign serves only to reinforce the regime and the most conservative sections of the clergy, and it makes the struggle much more difficult for the women's movement and democratic forces in Iran. Progressive feminists now have to struggle on two fronts, against fundamentalism and against empire. Afghanistan is estimated to be the largest covert CIA operation involving the training of thousands of Islamic fundamentalists. In 1987, US military assistance to the Mujahideen reached close to $1 billion. The US government funded thousands of Islamic seminaries or madrasas that sprang up in Pakistan along the Afghan border. Thus, the Taliban, which literally means the students, was born. The Taliban turned Afghanistan into a mass prison for women with no public life and in conditions of mass destitution and even starvation. The propaganda of the NATO occupation forces made the liberation of women synonymous with the liberation of the country from the Taliban. But I argue that they too use the agenda of gender equality to pursue their own interests, the occupation of Afghanistan for strategic geopolitical reasons. With US and Saudi support, the Taliban's influence also spread into the former Soviet Central Asian republics. The consequences of this US strategy was a loose network of seasoned cadre, which continued to operate even after they were decommissioned at the conclusion of the Afghan jihad. Thus, the Al-Qaeda was born. The imposition of Sharia law or the control of women under these regimes was and is based on the dictatorial imposition of Sharia law backed by the state. In Iran, women are routinely policed and persecuted for the supposed improper wearing of the hijab. And some of the traditions and even principles of Islamic jurisprudence are violated, such as the moral authority of Sharia versus the dictatorial imposition of the law, the use of juristic reasoning or ijtihad, the methodology of consensus or ijma, etc. The fundamentalists ignore these methodologies and structures. For them, there's only one narrow interpretation. Some argue that many of the provisions of Sharia law, specifically in relation to women, are still in the framework of the 10th century. Sharia law, strictly applied, cannot address problems of gender equality and will drive the social conditions of women back to a regressive past. The rise in political religious fundamentalisms coincided with the universalization of neoliberal globalization, the father of all fundamentalisms, if you like. God, we are told, also supports the free market. Neoliberal globalization and this extreme socio-cultural chauvinism exist together. They feed on and off each other. Today, no movement can effectively struggle against fundamentalism without a feminist perspective. This requires placing the women's question at the center of the agenda for social transformation. The challenge for feminists today is that in order to effectively confront and drive back fundamentalism in all its forms, we have to make our feminisms more relevant to the needs and demands of the masses of women. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Fundamentalism occurs in all major world religions. For example, the Christian right has become predominant in the United States during the presidency of George W. Bush, even as he raged against fundamentalism. When used in relation to religion, the term